Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. Every touch is a step forward. By Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. And by No Foods. No grain, no gluten, no guilt.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, a look behind the scenes of WNYC's Sugarland. This was a radio series, a podcast, and a comic that made headlines around the country when it first aired. We'll talk to the producer and the T1D mom who pushed to make it happen.
At the health unit, our sort of goal right now is to really get people finding health news who wouldn't be searching for health news, who might see health news as broccoli. We're like, how do we get people to engage with this information? You know what I mean? Because it's vital.
Plus, it's graduation time, and the smart people at the College Diabetes Network have a new creation, their Off to Work Guide. Find out more in our Know Better segment this week, and we'll take a look back at just an incredible event with riding on insulin and my local JDRF chapter. It was the first of its kind. Can't wait to tell you more about it. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I'm Stacey Sims. Really glad to have you along. We aim to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes by sharing stories of connection, talking to the movers and shakers in our community, athletes and celebrities, authors, bloggers, what they call thought leaders, and asking hard questions of healthcare companies, as well as featuring the tech folks that kind of push everything forward around here. If you're new to the show, my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes just before he turned 2, and that was back in 2006. He is now 13 and finished with 7th grade. Holy cow. And yeah, it is graduation, summertime. And if you are looking for work or you have a recent college grad who is, the College Diabetes Network has a great idea. We'll be getting to that a little bit later on. There is so much in this show already, but I got to put one more thing in. I'll tell you about this right up front here. Have you heard about Gavin Griffiths? He goes by DiAthlete on social media, and he decided to run 25 marathons in a month to raise money to help type 1 diabetes organizations. He was diagnosed with type 1 at the age of 8, and he finished this challenge. It's really amazing. About a week and a half ago as this episode is airing. And I wanted to bring you a little bit of the audio. He posted a few videos on Facebook. I'll link up to those in the show notes. But here's what he had to say a day or two after he completed the challenge.
Quite a frequent question that I've been asked since finishing the marathons is, what's next? And I can assure you, whilst I was out there running, that was the last thing on my mind. But what's next? You can see already I've had my hair cut, so that's one thing done that I needed to get done. And now my focus turns to the international education work of type 1 diabetes. And I'm quite excited because DiAthlete is applying to become a charitable incorporated organisation. And with that, we have the League of Diathletes, where there are some amazing advocates around the world, across each continent, more or less, living with type 1 diabetes and are willing to go the extra mile to supply type 1 diabetes education with the right forms of encouragement. There's a big gap sometimes that opens up in healthcare, and the patients and the professionals, if you like, the medical professionals, we want to bridge that gap by using our personal experiences to relate to others living with diabetes around us, and to produce quite active grassroots initiatives and workshops that provide a bit of fun into type 1 diabetes education.
Such great stuff. We'll be following along. I've reached out to Gavin and hope to have him on the show soon to talk about, what's next, but also all of the people he met along the way. A lot of people ran with him on this. People covered full marathons. They ran a little bit with him. It was really great. I guess he said the youngest runner that ran with him was 4 and the oldest was 70. Look, I'm never going to run a marathon. That is not in my wheelhouse. And I don't think you need to run a marathon or 25 to live well with diabetes, but I just think the inspiration that folks like Gavin show and showing the larger world, which still needs to know that people with diabetes can do anything. I mean, people are still diagnosed and told, stop doing sports. Don't run. You're going to hurt yourself. So congrats to him. And thanks so much for everything that you've done to further the cause and to raise money for a great cause as well. We'll get to the story behind Sugarland in just a minute. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And I remember in elementary school, even preschool, Benny was never self-conscious about diabetes. He would show his friends, here's how it's done. He would check and dose right in the middle of class. But this year we've seen a big change really since middle school started. He just finished 7th grade and he's still really comfortable with diabetes. He doesn't hide it, but he never wants type 1 to be the center of attention. He doesn't want to be known as the type 1 kid. And the Dexcom helps so much with that. He can glance at his phone, he can look at his watch, and the Dexcom G5 was the first FDA-approved device to let you make treatment decisions without a finger stick. And now with the G6, it's factory calibrated. It is amazing. And we have used it for a month and we've finger stuck. Is that the past tense? We've finger stuck a few times to make sure that what we're seeing is on target, but we've not yet had to calibrate. It has been incredibly spot on for us. Find out more about the Dexcom CGM system at diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. WNYC is New York's flagship public radio station. It's actually the most listened to public radio station in the U.S. So when I heard they were doing a series on diabetes, I was excited and I was a little nervous. Would they get it right? Would they focus at all on type 1? Well, it turns out they not only got it right, they provided information on type 1 and type 2 diabetes in a way we rarely see in major media. Clear, non-judgmental, informative. And with a great comic. They put out a panel drawing that tells a story. Many of you have seen this. If you haven't, I will link it up. I know you've seen it because people continue to send it to me. It's marvelous. Even though some time has gone by, I wanted to talk to them about this series. My guests this week are Mary Harris, editor and host of the WNYC Health Unit, and Dr. Cheryl Olson, who has an adult son with type 1 and contributed to the series. Dr. Olson, Mary Harris, thank you so much for joining me. I'm excited to talk to you about this. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks so much for having us.
Absolutely. Let's start, if we could, by talking about how Sugarland came to be. Mary, let me start with you, if I could. You've been covering health for a long time. I know diabetes is a topic that affects a lot of people, but how did this come about?
So we had always been interested in diabetes. We had a podcast called Only Human for a while, and one of our favorite episodes was one about diabetes. It was called The Robot Vacuum Ate My Pancreas, and it was about Dana Lewis, who, with her husband, made her own artificial pancreas and was sort of at the cutting edge of what type 1 diabetics are doing right now to kind of take control of their own health. But Cheryl came to us with this amazing story where she made it even bigger, and she made it about type 1 and type 2 and about everything that's going on right now. And we just thought we have to do this because it's so important to get the information out there.
And when we talk about Dana Lewis, who I recently had on the show for the second time, it is fun to talk to her, and it's amazing. To me, it's very inspiring, but it's also something that so few people with diabetes really can do, or, can find an old pump and feel comfortable with the knowledge of doing it that way. So Cheryl, how did you decide to take this further? What was the impetus for you?
I think the thing that got me excited, well, there was two things. One is that my son was diagnosed. He's not 28, but he was diagnosed his third week of college as a freshman. And I have a doctorate in public health, and my field is health and behavior. I know a lot about a lot of things, but I didn't know that people could get diagnosed at that age, that it was quite common. And I was blindsided by all of that stuff. So I kept a close tabs because of that on all the research coming out. And then I started to see things that blew my mind, not only the advances in both the do-it-yourself and the commercially available march towards artificial pancreas, but also I was seeing, there was a JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association article saying diabetes diagnosis and treatment costs $101 billion in a recent year. And I thought, what? It was the fastest growing, it was growing faster than heart disease. And I thought, why isn't anyone talking about this? And then starting to read about, well, actually maybe diabetes isn't 2 diseases, it's 3 or 4 or 5, and there are subtypes. And and anytime I might bring it up that, hey, I'm interested in this, like in an Uber or something, I always would get into these fascinating conversations of people saying, yeah, my dad back in India has this and I'm worried about that. Or, so that's kind of what got me saying there's a lot more going on here and we need to find out about this.
I know the feeling. Hey, before we talk more about Sugarland, let's talk about your son, because 3 weeks into his freshman year, You're just away from home. What a tough time. Can you share a little bit? I don't want to get too personal, but what you're comfortable with sharing. How did it go? And, what was the final sign that got his diagnosis?
Yeah, his college physical, the exam had turned up some sign. I don't remember what it was because, again, it wasn't really on my radar that he had some indicator that he might at some point develop diabetes. And other friend was a doctor, so that could be never. Don't worry about that. But if he does happen to, be very thirsty or have muscle aches or something, just kind of keep an eye out. We thought, okay, fine. Just another thing. There's so many false positives and so on that show up. And so he's off we were in the New York area at that time, and he was going to school in Oberlin, Ohio, a long ways away. And he calls me up at one point saying, I'm having these terrible muscle aches and I really don't feel well. And you think I should go to class or go to the ER? Go to the ER. And long story short, he goes to the little ER in Oberlin, Ohio, this little town. It's like less than an hour outside of Cleveland. And they test his sugar and it's high, and they give him a pamphlet and give him an insulin shot and say, you have diabetes.
What?
I was just beside myself. And and we had friends who live in Cleveland, bless them, and they took him to the Cleveland Clinic and they gave him a fire hose of information. And he ended up calling me up and on the internet with him, and we're trying to figure out how is he supposed to give himself a shot because they never even had him practice. And I'm just feeling like, you sent my 18-year-old son home to keep himself from dying, or home to his dorm, and what is with our healthcare system? Wow. And then he, very long story short, he was then encouraged to take a so-called voluntary leave of absence with them saying, we really don't know how to help you here. Yes, there are some other students here who have diabetes, but they were all diagnosed as kids, and we don't even know who they are because they don't self-identify. Right. And so actually, we were living in Boston, so I moved around a lot. We were living in Boston at the time, not York, and we were close enough to Joslin Diabetes Center that he ended up going home for the leave and going to Joslin and arguing with them strenuously until they would give him an insulin pump. And then it was rough because, he gets to a time when you really want to get away from home. He was so looking forward to being on his own, and he had to go back and he had the experience of going into, Jocelyn's kids clinic with all the little, circus motifs and stuffed animals. And here you are, you're trying to declare I'm an adult, and crap, you're back there in the kids table,
I hear you. Wow.
That was bad for him on so many levels.
How's he doing now?
Reasonably well. He has had real ups and downs with, I guess, what they used to call brittle diabetes, and times when it was really good and times when it was really not good. And there was a time I had to call the EMTs to break down his apartment door where he was unconscious. And that was, thank God, for the Dexcom app.
Yep. Can I ask how long ago he was diagnosed? I mean, how long has he been living with type 1?
Let's see. He's 28 now, and he was diagnosed at 18. So I got 10 years. Yeah. And I remember reading, looking just obsessively at the research. At one point, he was going to school in Scotland, and we thought, we'll get him the new system. Things are approved faster over there. He was a public policy master's student, and he was researching, why is it that they get the innovations approved over there faster than they do here, which is less true now. And we were hoping to get him a better system over there, and it just. Oh, yeah, it really, I got a little bit crazy for a while.
I hear you. It's funny because our timelines almost overlapped. I mean, my child is much younger, obviously, but your son was diagnosed shortly after mine, and we were thinking the same thing, like maybe we'll travel, maybe we'll go over here. That's interesting. So let me switch back over to Mary, if I could. I was in media for a long time, and I have been out of it, at least traditional media, radio and local television, for about 5 years now. Gosh, can you share a little bit, kind of behind the scenes, about how this stuff gets done for people who may not be familiar with how, radio stations operate and that kind of thing? I mean, when you decided to launch Sugarland, what happened? Did you, assign producers? Did you have to do interviews? How does it come to be? We'll get Mary's answer to that in just a moment, but first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. And last year, the One Touch team launched the Small Victories campaign, which aimed to recognize the small but significant accomplishments of those with diabetes. One Touch celebrated individuals for their efforts and encouraged the community to join the movement. Do you or someone you know use the One Touch VarioFlex meter? Nominate yourself or a loved one today for the Small Victories campaign by emailing onetouch@hellommc.com. That's onetouch@hellommc.com. I'll put that right in the show notes so you can come back to it later. And now back to host and editor Mary Harris telling us how Sugarland came to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, and you can really hear it when you listen to Cheryl's story there, right? Which is that chronic conditions like diabetes, they just show these bigger problems in the healthcare system. And that's what we really wanted to do with this series, which is like use this condition to really show all of these problems. And so what we did was we started digging for stories that were going to put that in relief. So one of our producers here helped Cheryl find the story of Alec Rayshawn Smith, this guy from Minneapolis, diagnosed at 24 with type 1 diabetes, and had this horrible thing happen, which is he couldn't get insurance to cover his supplies, and so he was rationing his insulin, and he passed away. And it's one of those stories that breaks your heart, but it's so important to tell because it shows all of these bigger problems that everyone with any condition is struggling with, which is he, was an adult when he was diagnosed, so that was a challenge. And then when he turned 26, he was getting off of his parents' insurance, and he had to buy insurance for himself. And the insurance was so expensive, he didn't feel he could afford it. And when he was purchasing his own insulin, he didn't feel like he could afford that. And so he was making very dangerous life choices. And I feel like stories like that get to the issues with diabetes in general, but then they also get to these much wider issues with the healthcare system and how it works and who it works for. And you guys were talking about, we talked about Dana Lewis, who built her own pancreas, which is amazing. And I feel like we're at such a crossroads right now where there is so much information, and we're getting so much more information, as Cheryl said, about diabetes being more than just type 1 and type 2 and all these high-tech ways to intervene. But at the same time, getting those interventions out to people is a challenge. We're not at a point where everyone has access to things. And so we really wanted to illuminate those things because they make the story so relevant to everyone. And everyone realizes it's not just like, oh, I might get diabetes, although you might. It's also that we're dealing with this system that isn't working. And here are some of the issues involved in it. And so, we were working with Cheryl, who's in California. We're in New York. And so we just established this really great team of people who was looking for these stories that would illuminate these challenges. And then we commissioned a poll from Harris Poll because we wanted to know how people thought about diabetes, whether they really understood the nuances of diabetes. And we found that they kind of did, but it allowed us to make a quiz online. And then we have a data news team here. And when they saw all the work we were doing, they were like, how do we make this bigger? How do we find a way to get this to more people? Because at the health unit, our sort of goal right now is to really get people finding health news who wouldn't be searching for health news, who might see health news as broccoli. Like, how do we get people to engage
That's a great point.
With this information? You know what I mean? Because it's vital. And so our data news team commissioned this illustrator to do an amazing, basically graphic novel of diabetes, which has all the information that you would want in this amazing format, and tells some of the stories that we learned along the way. So it was a case of teamwork makes the dream work. Yeah. So thrilled.
That cartoon, or that comic, as you said, the graphic novel, it's credited to Susie Cagle and to Dr. Olson. Is Susie the artist?
Yes.
I have never met Susie, and I need to send her a fan letter because she's amazing. She took I want to second what Mary's saying about the wonderful team effort here, where my husband went to high school with someone who was on one of the JDRF boards, who helped me jump into through some channels out here in California and New York to some interesting people. And then the team in New York at WNYC use their own channels and found other things. So I found Brandon Arbiter, the first one in that wonderful graphic novel, and he was delighted, by the way, with that thing. He was bursting, and it just brought. I interviewed him at a little sidewalk cafe in Oakland, California, and you almost feel like the reader gets a chance to be in that same spot with him through the graphic novel and feel his story. And then WNYC found this wonderful tracking rumors about, like, we're hearing about people who are saying someone died because they couldn't get insulin. They kind of just diligently tracked it with their news reporting skills and found that great story in Minneapolis, which is actually where I'm originally from. And so putting those two stories together through that graphic novel style, I thought was brilliant.
Yeah, it was all over and continues to be all over my Facebook news feed with friends who know our story and continue to send it to me. But in the diabetes online community, which is not really an official thing, but it was passed around as something that said, look, they got it right, which rarely happens. And not only, I give you all so much credit, this graphic novel or piece got type 1 right, got type 2 right, and, talked about the price of insulin. We'll link it up. I mentioned in the introduction, more about the cartoon, but we'll link it up and make sure that people can see it if they haven't yet. So kudos for you. I would love to see more health news presented this way, not just diabetes. I think you're right, Mary, as a former health reporter. And I always used to say, we should lead the news tonight. We should be the top story. Everybody cares about health. And they would say, yeah, eat your broccoli in the corner. So I hear you, Mary.
Well, it's like I had a wonderful producer say to me at some point, and like I really keep coming back to these words. She's like, I don't care about topics, I care about people. And I feel like the people you meet in these stories, you understand them, you get them, you're with them in these struggles. And like everyone's been in that frustrating doctor's appointment where you're going. Brandon Arbiter is someone else that we introduce you to, Cheryl really introduces you to, who is a guy who was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and then just kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker until finally someone at Columbia was basically like, listen, I think you have type 1, come in and we'll treat you. And, he was in a really dangerous situation, but he told these stories that were almost unbelievable. He came in for a fasting glucose test with his doctor and, get the results back. It looks like he's still getting worse. And the doctor says, why didn't you fast before this test? And he was like, I did fast. And the doctor's like, well, next time try fasting. It's just, everyone has had that stress experience with the doctor where you feel like I'm doing everything, I'm showing up, and the doctor, is just not picking up what you're putting down. And it helps to hear those stories, to realize like, oh, it's not just me, it's everyone else too. So
far too often. Go ahead, Cheryl, I can hear you want to speak.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, you can hear me nodding.
Good.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that happens to everybody, but it seems like it happens especially a lot to diabetics. My son would talk about that, and he'd talk about, going to a small town ER when he transferred to the College of William and Mary and in rural Virginia. At one point, when you're away from your kid and they say something is not right, you just don't know what to do. And I said, well, just go to the ER because that's the standard advice. But what he found, it was just probably no surprise to a lot of people who have diabetes, is that most emergency room people don't know much about type 1. Right. They never see them. They see tons of type 2s. He said that the TSA is much more familiar with insulin pumps than the typical ER personnel.
I believe that.
They get trained.
I believe that's because we travel so much. Oh my gosh! So when you put Sugarland out there, what was the reaction from your listeners? I was able to hear a couple of the calls where people shared some of their stories, but did you get feedback that this opened some eyes, Mary?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, like my favorite feedback was from Brett Michaels on Twitter, who is from the band Poison, who has type 1 diabetes and tweeted this out and was like, the story is so important, and shared it. And we were so grateful to him for doing that. And you know what? I'm so glad that you said the community is responding to you about how accurate the reporting is, because we got one note that we really struggled with. It was someone who saw the comic and had this reaction of, why are you putting type 1 and type 2 in the same category? type 1 is a physical condition, and, you get it as a child, and type 2 is, from diet. And it was really eye-opening for me, because I think we did a good job of separating those things out. And I didn't agree with the criticism, but I do think it illuminated something that's a challenge in the diabetes community that I'm sort of curious if you see too, where it's like you have these two versions of diabetes, these pillars in people's heads, right? Like, here's type 1 over here, and here's type 2 over here. And like, how do you get those people pulling forward together, and realizing that like and getting away from like, it's people's fault that they might have diabetes if they have type 2. I think it's a real challenge moving forward to just sort of get everyone on the same page, advocating for the same care. You know what I mean? And that response kind of illuminated that for me.
I'd love to answer that question if you all don't mind.
Yeah, okay. I would love it.
One of the funny things about interviewing people who work in media and are reporters is they wind up asking you questions. So I'll answer that, though, because I feel pretty strongly about it. And my position has evolved over the more than 11 years now that I've been in this community. I think a lot of people who are initially diagnosed with type 1, and I'll say most parents, because that's my wheelhouse. I can't speak for everybody, but I know more parents than adults with type 1. We are so adamant that people not blame our children that we start throwing the type 2s under the bus. And you start saying things like, they say, oh, did he eat too much sugar? And I wanted to say, yeah, he's 2. Yeah, I gave him only lollipops. But you start out with this mindset of, my child did not cause this. I am not to blame. Stop blaming me. Stop blaming my child. And you say, type 1 is an autoimmune disease. It's not caused by diet or lack of exercise. Whereas type 2 is a lifestyle disease that can be prevented or even reversed with diet and exercise. And the more education I've had over the years, the more I've learned that that's not really the case. There is so much of a genetic influence in type 2. I've met so many fit and healthy people diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. There's something else going on. I'm certainly not well-researched enough to give any answers on that. But over the years, my position has evolved to the point where if the diabetes community overall doesn't start speaking together, we're not going to agree on everything because nobody does. But if we don't take that power of, it's so sad, but 28, 30 million people now, we can't change anything. Look at the cost of insulin. If only type 1 people complain about it, it's not enough voices. We need that power of the community. So sorry to jump on my soapbox.
No, I love that you did that.
Yeah, but I'm sorry. I'm not surprised that that's the reaction you got. But I'm hoping that as we are all better educated, we realize that there's no need to change the name. There's a petition every year. We need to change the name of type 1 and type 2, and you can't just refer to diabetes. I disagree with that. I respect you if you don't. But to me, we really are in this together. And the better educated we are about all types of diabetes, the better off. So, aren't you glad you asked, Mary?
I'm so glad. No, I'm so glad because I feel like it's like this is the problem we have when we debate healthcare in Washington. Do you know what I mean? We get into, do you deserve that disease? Did you do something to, make yourself have that disease? Should I really pay for that condition? Who deserves care? And like, frankly, the more I report on health, I'm like, you know what? We all will need a break. And like, if you don't know that yet, that's because you haven't needed your break yet. And your time is coming, not to be like, the bearer of bad news, but like, it is true. We all need a break.
Well, everyone becomes a caregiver or, or a caretaker or needs the care at some point in their life. There's no way around that, unfortunately.
That's right.
Is there any plan to follow up on Sugarland?
Not right
series?
now,
okay.
But we will be following diabetes and sort of what keeps coming because it impacts so many people. Frankly, I mean, so many Americans are struggling with this. More and more people are being diagnosed as pre-diabetics, and there's so much question about what that means. My mom was diagnosed as pre-diabetic and was running around trying to figure out, like, how do I address this? Because she wanted to see if she could avoid medication and all those sorts of things, and she just felt like the system was set up to kind of drive her towards the medication. And it's just, there's always going to be a story here. This condition is really, it's an important one.
I think I generated like 15 or 20 story ideas, in a flurry initially when talking to WNYC, hoping we might eventually be able to follow up on more of them. But there's an endless number. I even was struck by when my son was, sent home in college with his initial diagnosis. they give them a glucagon emergency kit and say, oh, if you ever are unconscious, your roommate should be able to mix this together and give you a shot. And I thought, are you kidding me? And that's still, I just checked recently, that's still the advice they're giving to people. And I'm thinking, maybe if your roommate's a medical student, but I mean, there's just all these crazy things that people ask you to do. And then another big one that I would have loved to do more with was the terrible shame and shaming of especially the type 2s. And the more you research obesity and weight loss, and I have a background in studying that too, the more you understand that it's not a simple, well, if you just will keep your mouth shut and eat less. It's not that at all.
We'd all be
so many things that go into it. Yeah, exactly. It's incredibly, and there's reasons these things sweep across the, and even things in terms of what's in the plastics and hormones and all kinds of things that sometimes start out looking far-fetched and end up looking plausible. So, that's the emotional, I think that's what keeps this series interesting ultimately as we talk about the stories of the people and the emotion and the anguish and the shame and the fear that underlie dealing with this disease.
It really is. There's so much to talk about, unfortunately, but I'm so glad that you shined a spotlight. I mean, WNYC and the professionalism and the reputation that you all bring to this really elevated it. I'm not trying to just stroke your ego here, but I was thrilled to see that you did this. And I'm so excited that it keeps coming up. So please let me know if you decide to follow up or do some more. I'd love to continue to highlight it here. And I really look forward to it. And thank you so much for joining me. It's been great to talk to both of you. I hope we can talk again soon. Thank you so much.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
I hope they do more. It really was a good series, and it would be nice to have that kind of, non-biased, non-judgmental information out there more about diabetes. And forgive me for getting on my soapbox on the type 1 and type 2 situation. If you feel strongly about that, let me know. I'm going to put that in the Facebook group this week. Do you think we need a name change? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with what I had to say there? I feel very strongly about that. So I'll put that in the Facebook group. And if you jump on in, you can take part in that conversation. But I really appreciate that they came on to talk to me about Sugarland, and it was really fun. I've been out of radio for 6 years now. Sheesh. So it's always fun to talk to people in the business and find out, how things are going right now. Not too different from when I was there, but, more and more people are podcasting. More terrestrial radio stations are certainly jumping into the podcast. Okay. More info, of course, in the show notes and at diabetes-connections.com. Let's talk about your college student with type 1 who has graduated and is off to work. Never fear. The College Diabetes Network is here to help. That is our No Better segment this week. No Better is brought to you by No Better Foods. No Foods, grain, gluten, wheat, soy, dairy, peanut, yeast, and guilt-free foods. So how do they taste so good? I mean, we're talking about waffles and cookies and buns and wraps. Well, they're made with superfoods, chia, flax, coconuts, almonds, and egg whites. And their stuff is good. Pancakes and croutons. If you're gluten-free or soy-free, dairy-free, and you want to enjoy these foods, I highly recommend you check them out. It's not that bluggy consistency. That's a very technical term, but you know what I mean. It's really good stuff. Freezes great, easy to take on the road. Check it out. Just go to diabetes-connections.com, click on No Foods, and use the promo code Stacey10 when you check out to save 10%. I got an email this month from the terrific people at College Diabetes Network, and they have a new guide. It's called the Off to Work Guide, and it covers things, pre-unemployment steps, navigating health insurance, networking in a new place, workplace rights that people with diabetes have, how to use them, workplace accommodations. There is an easily downloadable guide, which I am going to link up at diabetes-connections.com in the show notes for this episode. And I do think this is such good information, not only for young professionals. I mean, you don't have to have been graduating this year to use it. It's great for people in the workforce in the beginning of their careers, but also for their employers. So this is something that you can use to talk to your employer about this if you're nervous, or, email to human resources, that sort of thing. They sent me a guide to look through, and it's very robust. This isn't like a one sheet with, fill out this form and we'll send your boss an email. It goes through controversial things like pros and cons of disclosing at work, interview tips when you have type 1 diabetes, how to talk about it, what happens if you have a low at work. What is your potential employer allowed to ask and how to handle those situations? There's a bit about mental health at work. There's financial planning, and it's all in a very straightforward way. It might be funny to say mental health and then flip right over to financials, but I love how they're handling all aspects of working with diabetes. Burnout, wrongful termination. These are things that can come up. And if you don't know your rights and you may not have any experience handling these things, how do you know what to do? So again, kudos to the College Diabetes Network for making this available. Again, I will link it up at diabetes-connections.com, and I highly recommend that you check it out. And of course, if you have a new college student or, your child is home for the summer, going off to college, or maybe you're listening and this is you, I definitely recommend the College Diabetes Network. They have great resources for kids and for parents. And I know that when it's time that we will be leaning on them for Benny. My daughter is finished with her junior year, so we were in full college mode. She doesn't have diabetes, but it is, man, what a process. And I'm glad that CDN will be there to help hold our hand later on. And now you know better. I want to tell you about a great event that I took the kids to, and I hope it comes to your community. And if you haven't heard about this, you're going to want to make some noise with your JDRF chapter. JDRF and Riding on Insulin have partnered for the first time. And in Charlotte, that's where I live, near Charlotte, North Carolina, we had the very first ever One Challenge. Now, we have the National Whitewater Center here, which is this incredible resource. It was kind of controversial, as you can imagine, when they built it several years ago because of the taxpayer stuff and everything else. But it's been here for about 10 years. It's not going anywhere. And man, it is amazing. So they offered whitewater rafting and ropes challenges and zip lines. And, the facility also has bike trails and walking trails. And I'm sure I'm leaving something out, but it's just incredible. They have concerts there in the summer. But bringing riding on insulin to something like this is, what's a good analogy? It's like bringing a big-time Avengers fan to Comic-Con. This is their element. This is what they do. They're into adventure sports. Of course, they started with snowboarding, and we talked to Sean Busby, the founder, just a couple of weeks ago. You can go back and listen to that episode if you'd like. But this is summer, right? These are all summer sports, and man, they were into it. And the idea here is that the kids can face their fears. The kids can learn that they are strong. They can face challenges. And of course, the hidden part of that is that the parents can stay behind and know that their kids are going to be okay without them. Huge kudos to Ann Sutton, who is the outreach coordinator at my local JDRF and who also is a very good friend of mine. Her son was diagnosed at age 3 when Benny was diagnosed at age 2. So we've known each other for a very long time. The boys are the same age. And she just hit it out of the park with this one. My kids, and it's for siblings too. Riding on insulin is for siblings, which is so important. So, my kids are at the point now where they're kind of lukewarm on going to diabetes events. Benny's 13. He's been doing this for 11 and a half years. If it's fun, he's going to go. And my daughter, she cares about her brother. She cares about diabetes, but, she's 16. So when they heard this was available, they were both in and they had a great day. I met some terrific people. Shout out to PJ, whose daughter Lucy was just diagnosed in March, and they hadn't met anybody with type 1. She didn't want to come to this event. This happens all the time. They made her come anyway, and I think she had a really good time. And I think more importantly, she saw other kids wearing their gear, pumps and pods and CGMs. And I don't think the kids there talk a lot about diabetes. I think they just kind of see each other and say, yep, recognize you. And then they talk about the ropes course or the whitewater rafting or whatever they're doing. And she just fit right in. It was really great to see. So thanks again, Riding on Insulin. Thanks again, my local JDRF chapter and Ann Sutton for setting that whole thing up. Can't wait to do it again next year. In fact, I heard from some other people who want to come down and visit me because the pictures on Facebook were so great. And so I think I'm going to have a full house next year if this event comes back with relatives and friends who have kiddos who want to attend. Couple of quick housekeeping notes before I let you go. I'm getting more and more email, which is fantastic. If you'd like to reach me that way, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com. And, I mentioned PJ a couple of minutes ago. He is not on Facebook. And I'm always shocked at people who are not on Facebook. But if you are not on social media, please reach out to me that way if you've got something to say. Email is certainly fine, and I try to respond as quickly as I can. If you are on Facebook, I urge you, join the Facebook group. We're going to be doing some promotions, and I'm doing things in the group that I'm not doing on the page. And part of that is because the conversations are so great in the group, and it's really nice to be able to just have that back and forth right away. Also, with Facebook's algorithm, most of the stuff on the page isn't seen by most of the people who like it. So that's frustrating, but the best workaround I have found is the group. So hop on into Diabetes Connections, the group. If email is your bag, we do have a newsletter, and I'll link that up in the show notes as well. No spam, no nonsense. And I always put something in the newsletter. It goes out every week. In addition to the episode, I stick something in there that's not in the show. So you can learn about other organizations, things to sign up for, stuff that's better read than listened to. So Facebook group, newsletter, easy to find me, easy to stay informed. I appreciate that very much. And thanks to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions, as always. So that's it for May. This year is flying by, but there's lots of good stuff left to come. There's just too many great stories in our community, but I'll continue to try to tell as many as I can. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.